What if I told you that a man once appeared, quite literally, out of thin air, in the middle of a city street, in a time he did not belong to? What if the police questioned him, photographed him, locked him in a cell, and then watched him vanish, with no explanation? This is not a story from a novel. No Hollywood screenwriter invented this. This is a case that, to this day, sits in the files of Ukrainian authorities. Unsolved, unexplained, and deeply, deeply unsettling. This is the case of Sergei Ponomarenko. To understand this story, you need to understand the city where it happened. Kyiv, 1990. The Soviet Union was crumbling. The air in Ukraine's capital was thick with uncertainty, politically, economically, and somehow, spiritually. People spoke of strange things, of a world unraveling at its seams. It was in this atmosphere, this particular sliver of human history, that something happened that no one has been able to explain since. On an otherwise unremarkable afternoon, a young man walked out of nowhere onto a busy Kyiv street. Not from a building, not from a car, just out of nowhere. And the people around him could tell, immediately, that something was wrong. Witnesses described a young man, appearing to be in his mid-20s. He was dressed strangely, not in modern clothing, but in the style of the 1950s. A buttoned shirt, high-waisted trousers, polished shoes. His hair was combed back in the fashion of a Soviet-era youth. He looked confused, disoriented. His eyes were scanning the street frantically, as though the world around him was completely foreign. He was clutching something tightly in his hands. A camera. An old vintage film camera. The kind you simply could not buy new in 1990. Passers-by stopped. They stared. Someone called the police. Officers arrived quickly. The man was cooperative, almost eerily so. He didn't resist. He didn't run. He simply looked at the police cars with an expression of complete and utter bewilderment. At the station, he identified himself. His name, he said, was Sergei Ponomarenko. He gave them a home address in Kyiv. He said the year was 1958. The officers exchanged glances. The year, as anyone standing in that police station knew, was 1990. 32 years had passed since the date this man was claiming to live in. The detectives who questioned Sergei noted that he was not raving. He was not erratic. He spoke calmly, clearly, and with complete internal consistency. He knew details of 1950s Kyiv that could only come from someone who had lived there. Street names that had since been changed, the locations of shops and tram stops that no longer existed, the names of local officials from that era. When shown a calendar, he went pale. When taken to a window and shown the modern city, the high-rise buildings, the different cars, the changed skyline, he sat down slowly and said almost nothing. He wasn't performing confusion. The officers' reports noted this specifically. Whatever was happening to this man, it was real to him. But the truly strange part, the part that made even the most skeptical officers pause, was the camera. Experts were called in to examine it. Their conclusion was unambiguous. The camera was genuine. It was a Soviet-made model from the 1950s. Not a replica. Not an antique purchased at a market. It showed decades of wear consistent with regular use. And it had been manufactured in a production run that ended in 1959. The film inside it was exposed. When developed, the photographs showed Kyiv. but not the Kyiv of 1990. They showed streets, buildings, and people dressed in the fashion of the 1950s. And in some of the photos, Sergei himself appeared, laughing, young, carefree, standing in front of landmarks that had since been demolished. These photographs became the centerpiece of the case and the most debated piece of evidence. Photographic experts examined the film, the development chemistry, the paper aging, the light exposure patterns. Everything was consistent with photographs taken in the 1950s. Not staged, not faked, not a modern recreation. One photograph in particular caused investigators to fall silent. It showed Sergei standing on a street that still existed in 1990. Behind him, visible in the background, was a building that had been demolished in 1963. How does a man in 1990 produce a photograph of himself, standing in front of a building that has not existed for over 25 years? The authorities, uncertain of what to do, held Sergei overnight in a secure cell. It was a practical decision. They had no category for what they were dealing with. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't insane. At least, not in any diagnosable sense. He was simply impossible. He was placed in a cell with no window, a single locked door, and a guard posted outside through the night. The guard reported nothing unusual. In the morning, the cell was empty. Sergei Ponomarenko was gone. The door had not been opened. The lock had not been tampered with. The cell had no other exits. The guard had not left his post and had heard nothing. There was no logical explanation, no escape route, no accomplice, no mechanism. He was simply gone. Officers searched the building, the street outside, the surrounding blocks. Nothing. Sergei Ponomarenko had walked into 1990, spent a few hours in a police station, and walked back out of it, leaving behind nothing but his case file, a set of developed photographs, and an impossibility that no one has solved since. The case was documented, filed, and, as was common in the late Soviet era, quietly buried. The officers involved were reportedly told not to discuss the incident publicly. The photographs and camera were taken into custody, and their current whereabouts are unknown. But stories have a way of surviving, especially strange ones. Over the following years, the account spread, first by word of mouth, then in print, then across the early internet as Ukraine connected to the wider world. And slowly, people began to dig. Investigators and amateur researchers began to look for a real Sergei Ponomarenko, someone who matched his description, living in Kyiv in the 1950s. What some claim to have found is extraordinary. Records apparently surfaced, or were reported to surface, indicating that a young man by that name had indeed lived at the address he provided. He had been reported missing in 1958. His disappearance had been noted in local records and then forgotten, one of countless mysteries absorbed into the noise of Soviet bureaucracy. If true, and that is a significant if, then Sergei didn't arrive from the past. He arrived in our time and returned to his own. What makes the Ponomarenko case particularly haunting is that it does not stand alone. Throughout the 20th century, similar cases were documented, and then quietly filed away. A man in 1950s New York who checked into a hotel with currency that didn't exist yet. A woman in Paris who wandered onto a street that shouldn't have been there. A Japanese soldier who appeared decades after a war ended, convinced it was still 1945. Each of these cases has its own explanations: psychological, historical, cultural. And yet, each of them contains that same core element: a person for whom time seemed to have behaved differently than it should. We don't know what to do with these stories. We never have. There is a question that I keep coming back to, no matter how many times I walk through this case. If Sergei Ponomarenko was real, if he truly slipped through some crack in time and landed in 1990, then at the moment he vanished from that cell, where did he go? Did he return to his own time? Did he find himself somewhere else entirely? Is he out there still, existing in some fold of history that we don't have access to? Or is he, right now, just as confused as he was on that Kyiv street in 1990, looking around at a world he doesn't recognize, wondering how it all went so wrong? Some cases close. Evidence is gathered, conclusions are reached, files are stamped and shelved and forgotten. The case of Sergei Ponomarenko has never closed. It sits open, like a door left ajar in a house where no one lives. We don't know what's on the other side. We don't know if the door leads anywhere at all. But something walked through it once, and it left footprints that no one has been able to explain. If you enjoyed this documentary, if it made you sit with that strange feeling that the world is just a little less certain than you thought, please subscribe. Share this with someone who loves a good mystery, and leave your theory in the comments below. Because the truth of Sergei Ponomarenko is still out there,